Hey there, history lovers and insomniacs. Welcome aboard the Drowsy Historian, where bedtime stories don't just tuck you in, they drag you through the dusty bedrooms, bathhouses, and bureaucracies of the ancient world. Tonight we sail back over 3,000 years, not to pharaohs and pyramids, but to real Egyptian lives where your alarm clock was the sun god Ra and your bed probably doubled as a grain storage unit. Forget Cleopatra. This is the story of the people who actually lived the daily grind, with sweat, secrets, and a surprisingly spiritual approach to soap. So, fluff your linen pillow, silence that modern obelisk you call a phone, and let's uncover what Egyptians did before the museum display cases froze them into silence. The day begins. Whether you like it or not, if you were an ordinary Egyptian, not a royal priest or a wealthy merchant, but just someone trying to make it through the next flood season, your day began the moment Ra dragged his golden chariot across the horizon. No snooze button, no blackout curtains, just light pouring into your clay brick house like divine judgment. Your house, by the way, wasn't some marble-clad temple. It was a sun-baked mud structure, the ancient equivalent of a heat trap with small windows to catch the breeze. And, let's be honest, a few unwanted insects. These homes were cleverly built with thick walls and flat rooftops that doubled as beds when the heat inside became unbearable. You didn't need Alexa to tell you the weather. You were the weather. If the wind picked up from the desert, you wrapped your tunic tighter and braced for a day of sand in your eyes and possibly your dinner. If the Nile rose just a little more than expected, you'd spend the afternoon yelling at your neighbour as your shared irrigation channel turned into a personal swimming pool. Meet Dadi and Tia, your average Egyptian couple. Let's walk through the morning with Dadi, a mid-level field worker, and Tia, his wife, a woman who handles everything from weaving linen to managing the family's surprisingly complex religious obligations. These two are not nobility. They're not even artisans, but they do represent the backbone of Egypt, the labouring class who made civilization possible while being almost completely ignored by history books. At sunrise, Tia is already grinding barley into dough, kneading with hands made strong by repetition. Her makeup, if you can call it that, includes kohl eyeliner made from ground galena. Not because she's trying to look cute, but because it helped prevent eye infections and ward off evil spirits. In ancient Egypt, beauty was both medicinal and magical, and failing to line your eyelids was practically a spiritual offence. Meanwhile, Daddy is checking the water levels in the irrigation ditches. No coffee, no breakfast, just a quick spit rinse, maybe a palmful of natron, that's baking soda mixed with salt and ash, and off he goes, barefoot on hot sand, to spend his morning with a hoe that's more spiritual artifact than tool. Hygiene, but not as you know it now. Before you start imagining these people as dusty, sweaty, and endlessly dirty, let's clear something up. Egyptians were obsessed with cleanliness. The only reason we imagine ancient folks as filthy is because our ancestors in medieval Europe couldn't tell the difference between a bath and a curse. Ancient Egyptians, by contrast, bathed daily, or at least splashed water on themselves and changed linen tunics when possible. They shaved their heads to avoid lice, scrubbed their bodies with coarse sand and scented oil, and used soap made from animal fat and alkaline salts. That bar of handmade goat tallow soap in your overpriced organic kit? Yeah, they invented that without the marketing. But don't romanticize it too much. Their toilets were usually ceramic bowls tucked away in the corner, or, if you were poor, a designated part of the yard. You'd cover it with sand and maybe pray the neighbour's goat didn't knock it over before the sun set. A tight schedule without a clock. Timekeeping in Egypt was mostly solar, but shockingly effective. Workers knew to start when shadows disappeared and stop when they reappeared again. There were no time cards, but don't mistake that for laziness. If you showed up late to your task station, say helping construct a temple wall or hauling bricks for a merchant's warehouse, You risked public shame or a literal beating. The state tracked labour using scribes who recorded everything from grain yields to absenteeism. There are preserved papyri where one guy was excused for missing work because his wife was bleeding. Another claimed he was bitten by a scorpion while making beer. Work-life balance, ancient style. Now, we hear a lot about how advanced ancient Egypt was. And sure, they had great architecture, irrigation, and belief systems. But let's not get carried away. They also believed that crocodiles were divine, used literal dung in medicine, and sacrificed cats during plagues. So, maybe let's not call them wellness gurus just yet. But here's the thing. They still outperformed many modern systems in hygiene, diet, and community structure. Their food was simple but nutritious. Their social systems emphasized cooperation. Their architecture didn't collapse every 30 years from poor planning like your apartment's leaking bathroom. By the time the Nile glittered at mid-morning, Dadi and Tia were deep into their daily routines. Their children, possibly 3 or 5 of them, given the infant mortality rate, might be chasing chickens, playing with carved dolls, or learning basic prayers from a local priest. No phones, no planners, no mental health apps. But also, no fluorescent lights, no 10-hour screen days, and no Uber Eats disappointments. They lived by the cycle of the river, the sun, and the season. And if that sounds peaceful, it probably was. As long as you didn't mind the occasional cobra under your bed or a sudden conscription into tomb building service. As the sun climbed toward its relentless peak and Daddy's back began to complain from hours of squatting beside irrigation channels, Tia was already elbow deep in a different sort of challenge, cleanliness. Because while modern humans struggle to keep a few dishes out of the sink and a sock out of the toaster, ancient Egyptians were maintaining hygiene routines that bordered on obsession, and all without a single plumbing fixture, towel rack, or body wash sponsorship. The very idea of being unclean, physically or spiritually, was disturbing to the Egyptian psyche. Dirt wasn't just unpleasant, it was dangerous. It meant you were inviting chaos into your home. It meant you were drifting away from Ma'at, the divine balance of order and harmony. So cleanliness was no longer just a personal preference, it was practically a religious obligation. Tia didn't simply rinse off in a basin and call it a day. First, there was the hair, or lack thereof. Most people, especially women, shaved their heads or kept hair extremely short to avoid lice, heat, and spiritual impurity. Children were often completely bald, except for one symbolic lock. And while it might sound drastic, anyone who's ever sat on a bus next to someone scratching furiously at their scalp might understand the appeal. Instead of soap bars from a spa boutique, they used natron, a naturally occurring compound made of sodium carbonate and baking soda scraped from dry lake beds. It acted as both a cleanser and a deodorant, and you'd rub it into your skin with a rough linen cloth or even a sand-dusted stone. Painful? Absolutely, but also effective. Modern dermatologists would probably wince, but hey, the exfoliation was legendary. And while she was at it, Tia probably dabbed her neck and arms with a mixture of scented oil and crushed lotus or myrrh. Perfume wasn't luxury, it was survival. In a world where the air was a cocktail of sweat, livestock, and river mud, the ability to smell like anything else became a kind of power. Even poorer Egyptians tried to scrounge for sweet-smelling resins or flowers. Everyone, it seems, had someone to impress. Now, if you think all this cleanliness was about romance or courtship, you'd only be half right. Intimacy in ancient Egypt wasn't a taboo topic, but it wasn't all sunlit lotus petals and whispered poetry either. It was structured, formal, even a little bureaucratic. For Egyptians, relationships were as much about contracts as they were about connection, which, depending on your opinion of modern dating, might sound oddly refreshing. You didn't just fall in love, you signed agreements. Literal, written documents between families that outlined what each party was bringing to the union: property, linen, livestock, status. And when things fell apart, divorce was on the table. In fact, women in ancient Egypt had a legal right to initiate it, a right that vanished from many other cultures for over 1,000 years. If you're starting to feel a little inadequate about your own social system, don't worry. So should we. These people built an entire civilization around common sense and cosmic fear, and somehow managed to grant more agency to women in 1300 BCE than many countries do today. Meanwhile, in the center of the neighborhood, the communal courtyard was coming to life. This wasn't just a space for kids to run around or for goats to chew sandal straps. It was a living, breathing social hub. Women traded baskets of lentils, gossiped about who had offered too little barley in the temple this week, and shared medicinal tips, like which priest had the best salve for sore joints, or which crushed beetle paste worked wonders for bad dreams. Tia would have been part of this loose circle of informal healers, traders, and midwives, her knowledge handed down not by medical school, but by generations of experimentation and oral wisdom. Sometimes, that wisdom included rituals we'd find bizarre, sleeping with certain amulets under the pillow, burning fish bones for fertility, or consuming lizard oil to protect against nightmares. That last one might not be FDA approved, but to them it worked. Across the city, wealthier families had more advanced amenities, indoor toilets, stone basins, perfume made with imported oils from Nubia or the Levant. Their bathrooms, if we can use that word, were decorated with faience tiles and religious symbols, as if to remind everyone that even your most private moments were still being observed by someone or something. Critics today love to imagine ancient life as dirty and brutish, but here's a sobering fact. Ancient Egyptians had better access to daily bathing than 18th century Europeans. While Parisians dumped waste into streets and covered it with perfume, Egyptians had already established guidelines for waste disposal, washing rituals, and seasonal purification ceremonies. One culture embraced spiritual hygiene, the other invented powdered wigs to hide their lice colonies. But let's not romanticize it too much. Bathing was still largely manual. You hauled water, or someone hauled it for you. If the Nile was flooded or contaminated, which happened regularly, the bathing ritual turned into something far more dangerous than refreshing. Parasites, crocodiles, and stagnant water were common risks. The Nile was sacred, yes, but it also killed people. Dedi, returning from the field just after noon, didn't head to a break room. He stripped off his soiled tunic and walked straight to a side alley, where he rinsed his body with cold water and dried himself with linen scraps. Then, if he had the energy, he might chew on mint leaves or palm resin to freshen his breath. Or not. Personal grooming had its limits when your body was a tool of labor and your food consisted mostly of onions, barley beer, and dried fish. There was no shame in simplicity, but there was shame in neglect. If you came to the temple dirty, people noticed. If your clothing smelled off, if your eyeliner smudged, if your nails were crusted with grain mold, you were judged. Not just by neighbors, but by gods. Because to appear in disarray was to signal that you had broken the sacred contract with cosmic order. So, while we sit smugly with our designer soaps and 20-minute showers, it's worth noting that these ancient people, with no electricity or plumbing, somehow managed to believe and act on the belief that how you care for your body reflects how you care for your soul. And maybe they were onto something. Chapter 2. Papyrus Hearts and Legal Love. By the time the late afternoon shadows crawled across the hot plastered walls of Dedi and Tia's home, the workday may have eased, but the complexity of human relationships was only just warming up. Because in ancient Egypt, the sun didn't just bake bread and tan skin. It also illuminated a web of love, jealousy, status, and strategy so elaborate it would make modern dating apps look like child's play with hieroglyphs. Let's set the mood. There are no candlelit dinners, no secret texting under the sheets, no awkward first dates over half-warm coffee. Instead, imagine approaching love through a scribe. That's right. a middleman with ink-stained fingers, and a penchant for legal phrasing. Marriage in ancient Egypt wasn't a fuzzy blend of hearts and poetry. It was paperwork, witnessed by neighbours, carved in contracts, and backed by the gods. Tia, before marrying Daddy, likely negotiated the terms of her union through her family. This wasn't desperation, it was control. Egyptian women had more legal autonomy than many of their historical, and, let's be honest, even modern counterparts. She could own property, she could inherit land, she could sue her husband, she could initiate divorce. And if the agreement was unfair or violated, she didn't need a priest, just a properly inked scroll and a witness who wasn't napping in the courtyard. But let's not confuse legal empowerment with emotional safety. For all the rights afforded to women, the emotional ecosystem of these relationships was often as tangled and transactional as it is today, just with fewer emojis and more cattle. If Tia wanted to prevent Daddy from taking another wife, that could be inserted into the contract. If Daddy wanted a guarantee that she'd contribute a certain amount of linen or labour to the household, that went in too. Children? Also part of the negotiation. Future inheritance? You bet. Even what would happen if either party developed feelings for someone else, it could all be legally stipulated. That's right. Ancient Egyptians had prenups, and they were savage. Now, all of this might sound incredibly unromantic, and in some ways it was. But here's the kicker. Egyptians didn't pretend love was eternal unless it was underwritten by the gods and a notary. They accepted that relationships were fluid. They built in exit plans. They assumed that human desire might fluctuate, that money might get tight, and that the neighbour's daughter might suddenly seem very interesting after harvest. Dark? Yes. Honest? Absolutely. And amid all these contracts, a peculiar paradox, Egyptian poetry and religious texts are full of breathtaking romance. They speak of longing, of beauty, of the way a lover's voice might ripple through the air like the Nile at sunset. These weren't just literary flourishes. They were expressions of a culture that could hold two truths at once. Love was sacred, and also negotiable. Let's not pretend the entire system was fair and sparkly. Class mattered. If you were wealthy, you could afford to marry for status. If you were poor, you married for labour and survival. Love? That was a luxury. And while women had rights on Papyrus, in practice, much depended on the temperament of the men around them and whether they could afford a proper scribe to record a grievance. There's an unearthed scroll from the 20th dynasty in which a wife accuses her husband of stealing her dowry and taking a second wife without consent. Her response? She moves back into her mother's house and sues him in temple court. The ruling? She wins the case, reclaims her assets, and forces him to return a borrowed donkey. Ancient Egypt, where heartbreak and livestock were legally intertwined. For Dedi and Tia, romance was wrapped in routine. A shared meal of lentils and onions, a stolen kiss behind a drawing sheet, a softly spoken hymn of gratitude to Hathor, goddess of love. But if things soured, the ink had already dried on the backup plan. Interestingly, emotional boundaries were managed with religious logic. Infidelity wasn't just a breach of trust, it was a theological error, a betrayal of Ma'at, the cosmic balance. You didn't just upset your partner, you risked divine retribution. There are texts describing how men who strayed too far could find themselves plagued with disease, misfortune, or, in one poetic warning, the rot of the tongue, which sounds far worse than losing followers on Instagram. Still, many couples flourished. Partnership in Egypt was not just about sex or romance, it was about function, division of labour, shared faith, mutual ambition, and sometimes even genuine affection, though that affection was rarely paraded in public. Public displays of emotion were generally reserved for funerals or festivals, moments where the veil of restraint could safely be lowered. Now let's talk jealousy. Not the sulky, wine-soaked kind, but the socially disruptive, reputation-shredding version. Jealousy could destroy trade deals, temple favors, or even incite neighborhood shunning. So how was it managed? Not through couples counseling or social media stalking. It was handled through contracts, spells, and shame. Yes, spells. If you suspected your spouse was wandering, you might visit a local priest and purchase a binding incantation, scribbled on papyrus and buried near the bedroom. Or you might bake a loaf of bread with truth salt and serve it with dinner, believing that if your partner was guilty, they would be unable to swallow it without choking. Superstition meant snack time. Critics of ancient culture often mock this stuff, reducing it to fairy tales and barbaric nonsense. But how different is it really from modern rituals? Do we not still swipe left and right hoping for cosmic alignment? Do we not still chase compatibility through algorithms and awkward coffee dates, praying that someone's Spotify playlist matches their soul? At least the Egyptians had the honesty to admit that love is confusing, fragile, and best handled with the help of a good scribe and some protective oil. Back in the courtyard, as the sky turned golden, couples gathered. Maybe a song drifted out from a neighbor's window. Maybe an argument broke out over a miscounted goat. Maybe Daddy slipped an extra lotus flower into Tia's basket, a quiet apology for being late to dinner again. Or maybe nothing happened at all. Just another ordinary day in a civilization that somehow balanced romance, legality, spirituality, and survival in a way that we, with all our gadgets and gadgets for the gadgets, are still trying to figure out. And as twilight settled and the oil lamps flickered, Egyptians returned to their rooms, their contracts, their whispered prayers, each of them little universes of desire and discipline, passion and paperwork, held together by the same stubborn hope that life, even when hard, was still worth sharing. When the ink on a marriage contract began to smudge with resentment and the whispers around the courtyard thickened with speculation, it wasn't just the relationship that unraveled. It was reputation, survival, and, occasionally, the integrity of one's furniture. Ancient Egyptian relationships, for all their ceremony and spirituality, were not shielded from the same jealousies, betrayals, and quiet collapses that plague the modern household. They just handled it with a bit more incense and a lot more paperwork. Let's return to Tia and Daddy, our now familiar couple navigating the shifting sands of a domesticated desert life. Let's imagine that over the past few moons, Daddy had been a little too friendly with the perfume seller's daughter. Or perhaps Tia had stopped singing the morning hymn. These small lapses weren't just personal, they were social hazards. In a world where privacy was mostly theoretical, where walls were thin, families slept in the same room, and entire neighborhoods shared courtyards, there were no secrets. Only gossip delayed by a few hours. But unlike modern relationships where unraveling love often simmers in silence or explodes over phone bills, Egyptians had a path. It began, usually, with mediation, not counseling. That would be too soft. This was more public confrontation, often with elders or priests present. You stood in front of your peers and explained why you believed your partner had failed the contract. You didn't talk about feelings, you talked about evidence. If Daddy had failed to provide oil, food, or clothing as agreed, Tia could recite the terms of their marriage like a legal scholar and demand recompense. If Tia had stopped maintaining the household shrine or spent too much time at the river market, Daddy could claim spiritual or economic neglect. Every marriage came with expectations, and when those expectations weren't met, the consequences could range from public shame to legal dissolution. Divorce, while not taken lightly, wasn't rare or scandalous. In fact, it was almost businesslike. A woman could reclaim her dowry, retain her personal property, and, depending on her standing, even retain custody of the children. There are preserved papyri that read like exit interviews, where former spouses agree to part ways, in peace, without ill will, though one wonders how many truly meant it. But of course, it wasn't always clean. There were curses. If mediation failed, if one party refused to yield, Or if someone left the relationship bitter and powerless, magic filled the gap where justice had crumbled. Tia might visit a local wise woman to craft a clay figurine, a tiny likeness of Didi, inscribed with phrases like, "He who broke the balance shall know the gnashing of bones." It would be buried under his threshold or tossed into the Nile, depending on how vengeful the mood was. Spite, it turns out, predates every religion. Then came the rituals, not the gentle yoga and sage type, but serious, spine-chilling invocations. Spells against unfaithful lovers appear in ancient texts, warning of fevered dreams, sexual impotence, and social ruin. One fragment reads, "Let his heart be like stone, and his seed like dust." Subtle? No. Effective? Who knows? But what matters is the belief. And belief was currency in Egypt. And yet, through all this emotional combustion, Egyptian women continued to rise. The image we often have of the obedient, veiled background wife doesn't match the lived reality. Many women, especially in cities like Thebes or Memphis, ran their own businesses, signed contracts, hired labourers, and built wealth. Some controlled estates, others operated taverns. A few traded in perfume and cosmetics, one of the most lucrative markets of the time. These women didn't just manage households, they managed economies. We have records of one woman, Nebet, who owned vineyards, employed over 40 workers, and even lent grain to local temples with interest. Another, Iput, managed a textile workshop and trained dozens of apprentices. These weren't rare cases. They were examples of how embedded women were in the economic machinery, and how much they stood to lose if a marriage failed and property was contested. Critics often claim that ancient societies were universally patriarchal, and while, yes, power tilted toward men in most political and religious hierarchies, Egypt was a peculiar outlier. Women's rights were codified into law. They could sue, inherit, and bequeath. And unlike in Rome or Greece, Egyptian women retained their maiden names after marriage, a subtle but powerful reminder that identity wasn't consumed by union. But let's not gild the obelisk. For every empowered Nebet, there were women married off at 14, women beaten behind closed doors, women who watched helplessly as their husbands brought second wives into already crowded homes. Abuse existed, hidden behind piety and ritual. The same system that allowed for legal independence could also be used to trap, intimidate, or exploit, especially when male relatives colluded to silence complaints. So, while we might admire the progressive glimmers in Egypt's treatment of women, we should resist the urge to romanticize it too much. Yes, it was more evolved than many other ancient cultures, but more evolved than today? That's not the question we should be asking. The better question is, why are we still catching up? As dusk crept in and oil lamps flickered against mud walls, the broken marriages, the whispered spells, and the contracts turned sour didn't just disappear. They became part of the rhythm. Communities adjusted. Gossip morphed into legend. And the next generation watched, learned, and quietly began drawing up their own terms. For Dedi and Tia, if they ever reached this threshold, the fallout would be felt not just in their home, but in the entire courtyard. Who would keep the family shrine? Who got the grain jars? Would Dedi be welcome at festivals? Would Tia be whispered about by the water jars, or hailed as brave for walking away? Ancient Egypt may have believed in cosmic balance, but domestic life was a different story altogether, full of mismatched expectations, broken promises, and the quiet resilience of those who knew that sometimes survival meant saying goodbye. And as the night closed in over the Nile, and crocodiles drifted under silver light, the only truth left was this: relationships, no matter the era, are fragile threads. Whether stitched by love, sewn by law, or tied together by fear of divine retribution, they stretch, fray, and sometimes snap. And when they do, history doesn't remember the quiet heartbreak. It remembers the woman who took back her dowry and made her ex return the ox cart. Chapter 3. Backbreaking and blessed. Work in the land of the Nile. By the time the stars faded and the eastern sky began to whisper of sunrise, ancient Egypt was already stirring. Not in the royal courts or the painted halls of temples, but in the fields, workshops, and riverbanks. The beating heart of a civilization that measured success not by how many pyramids you could build, but by how well you could keep the grain flowing, the linen weaving, and the copper melting without collapsing from exhaustion. The average Egyptian didn't have a career. They had a function, a role they were born into, trained into, or thrust into by necessity. There were no job boards, no interviews, no dream chasing. There was labour, inheritance, and if you were lucky, a trade you could pass on to your children. Work wasn't just economic, it was social, religious, and existential. It defined your place in the cosmic order. Take Daddy, our everyman. You've met him as a farmer, a husband, a faithful servant of the sun. But like many Egyptians, Daddy was more than one thing. During planting season, he toiled in the fields. During festival days, he carried supplies for temple rituals. When river floods disrupted the grain cycle, he might work on building projects, hauling stone, shaping bricks, feeding carts of limestone down a corridor towards some scribe's idea of divine architecture. This kind of job fluidity wasn't liberation, it was obligation, and it was relentless. Farming in ancient Egypt was not the idyllic hobby of modern influencers with herb gardens and sun hats. It was a brutal negotiation with the elements. Sure, the Nile made the soil rich, but it also made the calendar unpredictable. One bad flood and you were scraping mould from last year's stores. One low flood and you were preparing funeral shrouds. The entire agricultural system depended on a river that cared nothing for your deadlines. The tools were primitive but effective. Wooden ploughs, bronze sickles, baskets woven from date palm fibres. Animals helped, but only if you could afford them. Most of the real work was done with hands, feet, and sheer determination. And it wasn't only men breaking their backs under the sun. Women like Tia hauled water, gathered reeds, harvested flax, and processed grain, their contribution essential, invisible, and unpaid. Children entered this world early. By the age of 6 or 7, they were expected to help. Not in some quaint, teach responsibility kind of way. In the, you're smaller, so crawl into the grain bin and fetch the dead rat kind of way. There was no childhood. There was only preparation for adulthood, and that preparation was indistinguishable from labour. And then there were the trades. Egypt's artisans weren't free spirits making pottery for fun. They were trained, regulated, and often state-employed. Stonecutters, carpenters, metal workers, all essential to temple building, tomb carving, or royal vanity projects. They worked under overseers who tracked quotas and punished errors. Entire towns like Deir el-Medina existed solely for these workers and their families. From the outside, it might seem like a creative community. From the inside, it often felt like a highly supervised work camp. There's a papyrus from the 20th dynasty where a stonemason complains that he hasn't been paid in grain for over 20 days. His children are hungry and he's considering walking off the job. The result? A written reprimand for lack of spirit. Because in a system where your sweat built God's houses, complaining was heresy. Still, some trades had perks. Perfumers, for example, were chemical geniuses. They crushed exotic resins, mixed oils with powdered flowers, and cooked them in clay ovens at precise temperatures to create fragrances that could last for years. The recipes were closely guarded secrets, passed from parent to child with religious reverence. The wealthy bathed in these oils. The dead were embalmed with them. The perfumer walked a strange line between science and sanctity, underpaid but vital. Then there were the scribes. Ah yes, the office workers of the ancient world. If you were literate, you could escape the physical brutality of labour. You'd instead endure the soul-numbing tedium of ink, records, taxes, and bureaucracy. Scribes were both admired and despised. They could document history or destroy reputations. They kept track of crop yields, temple donations, divorce settlements, and legal disputes. And while their job was cleaner, it wasn't easier. Every error was permanent. Every omission punishable. Education for scribes began young and was reserved for the elite. You didn't become a scribe because you were bright. You became a scribe because your father had a scroll and your uncle knew a priest. It was nepotism with ink. Meanwhile, entertainers, musicians, dancers, acrobats provided joy, ritual, and distraction. But don't picture standing ovations and artistic fulfillment. Performers were often marginalized, especially women. They were praised in public and whispered about in private. They played at festivals, funerals, and in private gatherings, sometimes more as servants than as artists. Their beauty was currency. Their skill often taken for granted. And yet, the arts flourished. Harps, lyres, double flutes, and frame drums echoed through homes and temples alike. Music soothed gods, honoured the dead, and inspired the living. And still, no pensions, no unions, no applause. Now, here's a thought that should make you squirm. For all our modern technology, our AI, our ergonomic chairs and coffee machines, a good portion of the world still works harder and gets less than Dadi did, only without the promise of divine reward or spiritual cleanliness. Because in Egypt, even when work was cruel, it was meaningful. Labour wasn't just about survival. It was part of a cosmic economy. You were participating in the eternal rhythm of creation. When Daddy hauled bricks, he wasn't just helping a builder. He was aligning his soul with Ma'at, the force that held the universe together. When Tia kneaded dough, she wasn't just feeding her children. She was performing a sacred act of nourishment ordained by Hathor herself. Yes, it was exhausting, often unfair, sometimes tragic, but it made sense. It had a place. Unlike now, when many work jobs they despise for systems they don't understand, with outcomes they don't believe in. That's not nostalgia talking. That's criticism. A recognition that somewhere between divine bricklaying and PowerPoint presentations, we lost something. Purpose, maybe, or faith in what labour is for. As evening approached, Daddy returned home aching, not just in body but in spirit. He had done what needed to be done, and tomorrow he would do it again, not for glory, not for promotion, but because that's what you did when you were alive in Egypt. You laboured, you contributed, and you hoped the gods noticed. And if they didn't, well, there was always another field to plough. Not all work in ancient Egypt involved the golden glow of barley fields or the meditative precision of weaving linen. Some jobs were whispered about. Others were flatly denied at dinner conversations. These were the necessary evils of society. The handlers of bodies, the scrapers of filth, the silent labourers who moved beneath the surface of Egypt's polished facade. If Daddy broke his back in the sun, these were the people who toiled under the weight of society's shame, its superstition, and its rot. Let's begin with the embalmers, the necromancers of practicality. Mummification wasn't just a ceremony, it was an industry. Entire districts were dedicated to the process. These men, often part priest, part chemist, were charged with ensuring that the dead reached the afterlife intact. But despite their religious importance, embalmers lived on the fringes of social life. You see, death was sacred, but touching the dead was polluting. It was a contradiction that only religion could excuse, and only economics could sustain. The embalmer's tools were humble and horrifying. Hooks to remove brains through the nose, obsidian knives to slit open the abdomen, stone jars for storing livers, lungs, stomachs, and intestines, all labelled neatly for eternity. The body was then stuffed with natron, dried, wrapped, sealed, and sometimes painted. It sounds like reverence, but let's not sugarcoat it. Mummification was part art, part science, and part macabre production line. Some embalmers worked in the open, near temple grounds. Others operated in more remote places, away from the nostrils and judgment of the living. The stench alone was enough to brand you with a kind of spiritual shame. If you returned home from work still smelling faintly of putrefaction, it didn't matter how many gods you served, your neighbours crossed the street when they saw you. And yet their work was essential. Without them, the entire afterlife economy collapsed. A badly preserved body meant a restless spirit. A restless spirit meant illness, crop failure, and bad omens. So while the job was dirty and the pay inconsistent, it came with power. Invisible power. The kind that only truly surfaces when things go terribly wrong. Then there were the cleaners, though that term is a kindness. These were the street sweepers, the gutter scrapers, the latrine diggers, the handlers of the unspoken. Public sanitation in ancient Egypt was rudimentary, but surprisingly advanced for its time. Homes had cesspits or ceramic jars for waste. Larger compounds might have rudimentary drainage systems, but someone had to empty them. Someone had to haul human waste through narrow alleys and out into the desert. It wasn't glorious, it wasn't divine, but it was required. These workers, like embalmers, were socially low and ritually impure. But unlike embalmers, they had no spiritual framing to elevate their labour. No one prayed for the latrine man. No child bragged about wanting to clean nightjars. They were paid in grain, often poorly. Their families were marked by smell and silence. Yet without them, disease would have decimated cities. The Nile gave life, but it also spread illness. Without basic sanitation, plagues would have spread far faster. Even so, many Egyptians believed that disease was more likely the result of sin or spiritual imbalance than bacteria. The concept of microbes hadn't emerged yet, so while some good practices evolved, like hand washing before meals or boiling water during floods, the underlying rationale was mystical. And so, ironically, those most crucial to public health were also the most ignored by it. There were other jobs too that flirted with the divine and the cursed. Consider the spiritual fixers, exorcists, charm writers, dream interpreters. These individuals lived in a strange twilight between priesthood and folk medicine. They carried kits of amulets, oils, and scrolls. They were summoned when a child stopped speaking, or a cow refused to eat, or someone dreamed repeatedly of scorpions and shadows. Their success depended not just on skill, but on performance. They had to appear wise, powerful, and slightly unnerving. Some wore dark clothing, others never cut their hair. All cultivated an air of mystery, which was just as important as whatever remedy they delivered. But failure came at a cost. If the spell didn't work, if the illness worsened, suspicion turned quickly to blame. These healers could be accused of causing the illness. The line between medicine and sorcery was paper thin, and in some eras punishable by death. Still, they were used, especially by women, who had fewer formal legal tools to address misfortune and relied more heavily on the spiritual network of midwives, dream readers, and neighbourhood spellcasters. For them, justice wasn't just what happened in court. It was what happened when the wrong person got sick at the right time. Now imagine your tear. Your husband has taken ill. He coughs at night, cannot rise in the morning, complains of visions. The priest says it's punishment for skipping offerings. The neighbour says it's a curse from the linen merchant's widow. The exorcist says it's a demonic ghost of a forgotten ancestor. You don't know who to believe, so you call them all. You pray, you pay, you mix crushed amulets into his stew and hope for the best. And when he recovers, or dies, you attribute it to the last remedy tried. Confirmation bias, ancient edition. Critics often mock ancient labour as simplistic or unskilled, but here's the thing. These people solved complex problems with no electricity, no internet, no antibiotics, and no margin for error. You couldn't Google how to preserve a corpse or how to treat sewage during a flood. You had to know. You had to remember. You had to pass that knowledge down. and you had to do it while being insulted, ostracized, or feared for the very work that held your society together. It's not that different today, really. We still devalue essential workers, still ignore the people who scrub the operating room floors or collect the trash that keeps our cities from collapsing into rot. We praise doctors and curse the janitor when the bathroom smells. We glorify invention, but forget who tightens the bolts. So when we talk about ancient Egypt, its beauty, its spirituality, its architectural genius, we must also talk about the man digging latrines with a bent stick, the woman wrapping a stranger's corpse with fingers cracked from salt, the child collecting rat bones for an apothecary's shelf. They were there, always there, beneath the incense smoke and behind the linen curtains, doing the jobs no one wanted to see, but everyone needed done, and they did them without applause, without statues, without recorded names. Only a few mummified fingerprints left behind, pressed into the wrappings of royalty or the clay of discarded pots, to remind us that civilization doesn't rise on pyramids alone. It rises on dirty hands, tired backs, and the quiet dignity of invisible labour. Chapter 4. Kitchens, cot beds, and the gods between walls. If the temples were Egypt's lungs, breathing sacred chants across the land, then the home was its heartbeat, pulsing with quiet rituals, burnt bread, family bickering, and prayers whispered between bites of onion and barley. The average Egyptian home, small and sun-baked, was never silent. It creaked and buzzed and clattered with the noises of living, and within its mud-brick walls lay a complexity that often goes unnoticed in the polished reliefs of museum halls. Let's start with the kitchen, or, more accurately, the corner of the courtyard where food happened. There was no chimney, no counter, no marble-topped anything. Just a low clay oven, maybe a grinding stone or two, and a woman, always a woman, bent over a pot of lentils that refused to boil fast enough. Wealthier homes had small chambers for cooking with built-in storage niches, but for most, the process of meal-making was intimately tied to the rhythm of the sun and the mood of the fire. The most common food? Bread. Not the fluffy, yeast-fluffed loaves, but dense, rough slabs made with stone-ground flour, often flecked with bits of quartz or sand from poorly sieved grain. It was nutritious, sure, but it also shattered more teeth than any war ever could. Archaeologists have found countless skulls with worn molars and abscesses, not from sugar, but from trying to survive breakfast. With the bread came beer, thick, soupy, slightly sour, brewed at home with wild yeast and often consumed like soup. Even children drank it. It wasn't just hydration, it was safety. Water could be dangerous, especially during certain seasons, but beer was fermented, blessed, and had the added benefit of keeping you just tipsy enough to ignore the fleas. Meat was rare, usually reserved for feast days or funerals. Most protein came from fish, lentils, or the occasional roasted goose if your neighbour liked you enough to share. And despite what luxury tomb paintings suggest, the average Egyptian didn't sit on cushions surrounded by grape-fed cattle. They sat on reed mats, with flies in their ears and dust in their mouth, and hoped the bread didn't crumble before the stew finished cooking. Now let's move to the sleeping space. Another illusion shrouded in modern fantasy. There were no fluffy pillows, no wooden beds for most, just a woven mat, maybe a folded linen cloth, laid out on a flat rooftop in warmer months, or in a cramped corner when the wind screamed through the alleys. Couples slept curled around each other, children nested nearby like loyal cats, and personal space was a concept reserved for gods and royalty. Still, the home was sacred, not because of what it had, but because of what it held. Each household, no matter how poor, maintained a shrine, sometimes just a niche in the wall, sometimes a painted pot, or a limestone figurine of a favoured deity. Offerings of bread crusts, drops of oil, or dried flowers were left with small prayers muttered in half-sleep. These weren't grand gestures. They were daily negotiations with the divine, modest insurance policies against plague, famine, and misfortune. And there were rules. You didn't cook during eclipses. You didn't sweep after sundown. You didn't speak the names of angry ancestors during storms. Superstition wasn't quaint, it was necessary. When every meal depended on the Nile's mood and every illness could turn fatal, control became a spiritual theatre. You played your role, not to win, but to survive. Now let's talk parenting, though the word feels too modern, too curated. In Egypt, raising children was a collective, often chaotic affair. Infants were swaddled in linen, carried on backs, fed goat's milk or barley porridge. There were no diapers, no creams, just patience, reeds, and prayer. Mortality rates were high. Half of all children didn't live past 5. Every fever was a battle, every birth a gamble. And yet, Egyptian children were loved. Depictions of fathers cradling babies, of mothers grooming tiny heads, of older siblings guiding toddlers along riverbanks. These weren't artistic tropes. They were emotional truths etched into limestone. Egyptians loved deeply because they lost often. They cherished because they feared. And in that fear they found tenderness. Education, for most, was oral. Stories told by firelight. Rhymes carved into clay. Discipline came with a stick, affection with honeyed words. Only the elite sent sons to temple schools to become scribes or priests. Daughters were trained at home, not just in domestic tasks, but in spiritual duties, herbal remedies, and, if the family was ambitious, in commerce. Tia, for example, would have taught her daughters to make perfume from crushed lilies, to bake with correct proportions, and to speak certain prayers backwards, just in case. Her sons, like Daddy Jr., would have learned to respect boundaries, carry water without spilling, and avoid angering cats. Believed to be divine and, frankly, terrifying. And all of this, every cracked pot, every chant, every sleepless night, unfolded beneath a silent layer of criticism from the gods above. Because no matter how well you cleaned your floor, if your offering was late, or your breath smelled during prayer, or you allowed your shadow to fall on the sacred bread, it was a mark, a stain, a reason to worry that misfortune would knock at your door. Critics of ancient religion often dismiss these fears as primitive, a society bound by superstition. But is it so different now? Don't we still light candles for luck, avoid certain numbers, wear crystals, or chant affirmations as if they came with guarantees? We've just updated the gods, rebranded the rituals. The truth is, fear is universal. It just changes costume. Back in Tia and Daddy's home, the oil lamp flickers. The day's heat has retreated. The children sleep, curled like commas. A dog barks in the distance. Tia whispers a quick prayer to Taweret, the hippo goddess of childbirth, though she's no longer pregnant. Old habits. Daddy yawns. He smells faintly of barley and regret. But tomorrow will come. And with it, another chance to survive, to please, to not be cursed. Their home is not elegant. Their bed is not soft. Their life is not simple. But it is full. Full of breath, of food, of noise, of fear, of love. And in that fullness, somehow, they make meaning. The Egyptian household wasn't just a place to sleep or cook. It was a fragile arena of devotion, performance, and invisible negotiations with forces that, though unseen, were believed to be watching. Always watching. In these humble homes of clay and sweat, belief wasn't something that lived in temples alone. It lived in the quiet murmur over lentils, in the placement of a figurine near the door, in the way a broom was leaned against the wall before nightfall. To live in ancient Egypt was to be observed, not just by neighbours or family, but by a sprawling pantheon of gods who seemed as nosy as they were powerful. There was Isis in the kitchen, Bes under the bed, Taweret in the birthing room, and Thoth over the children's ink-stained fingers. These weren't remote deities. They were intimate ones, woven into every step of domestic life, every breath, every sigh. The shrine, no matter how modest, was the epicenter of this spiritual choreography. In most homes, it was a recessed niche in a wall, a raised ledge in a corner, or even just a carefully chosen shelf. Here, statuettes stood, often clay or faience, rarely gold, and looked out over the household. They were offered scraps of food, drops of beer, tiny hand-ground incense pellets made from resin and dried herbs. The offering was less about generosity and more about obligation. To forget it, or worse, to perform it sloppily, invited danger. And it was a very specific kind of danger. A bad harvest? Maybe you forgot the bread offering. A child's fever? Maybe you didn't sweep the threshold at dusk. A string of bad dreams? Perhaps the ancestors were angry. In this world, the divine was petty, and maintaining good standing required daily maintenance. Like a cosmic landlord with a long memory and a short fuse. Let's not pretend this was all solemn prayer and careful reverence. It was often exhausting, repetitive, performed with the robotic patience of people who didn't want to take risks. Most households had a rhythm of rituals passed down without explanation. You didn't ask why mother murmured a certain chant before grinding barley. You just did it. Because she did. And her mother before her. And so on. Faith was practical, not philosophical. Children were trained early. Before they could write their names, they knew which corner not to touch, which bowl not to spill, and how to nod politely toward a statue while holding a slice of melon. If a child forgot a prayer, it wasn't just scolding, it was terror. Because punishment wasn't coming from the parents, it was coming from somewhere darker, somewhere eternal. These fears weren't abstract. Egyptians believed in ghosts, restless spirits, malevolent forces that clung to homes like mildew. If an ancestor wasn't buried properly or remembered regularly, they could return, not to say hello, but to ruin crops, poison food, and rot relationships from the inside. A small fight between neighbours? Could be a ghost. A goat miscarrying? Ghost. A pot breaking for no reason? Ghost. And so every act, every blink, was weighed under the shadow of divine surveillance. Tia, being the keeper of the home, bore the weight of most domestic rituals. Her duties extended beyond cleaning and cooking. She was the mediator between family and spirit. She tracked the lunar cycles. She timed offerings. She remembered which gods were prone to jealousy and which ones liked music with their wine. If Daddy forgot his prayer before harvest and something went wrong, it would be her fault. By silence, by association. This was spiritual labor, and it never ended. Yet, within the monotony, there was also comfort. The gods, for all their temperaments, provided structure. In a world where plagues arrived without warning and children died without explanation, rituals gave the illusion of control. Perform the chant, light the incense, mark the doorway in ochre, and maybe, just maybe, the chaos would pass over your roof and land elsewhere. Even festivals, moments of public joy, carried the weight of household responsibility. Major celebrations like Opet or Wag Festival had citywide rituals, but families were expected to echo them at home. Decorating thresholds, sharing communal bread, singing specific songs. These weren't optional. They were another page in the unspoken contract between human and divine. During the Wag Festival, families floated small reed boats on the Nile, each one lit with a flickering flame to honor the dead and guide them to peace. It was beautiful, thousands of glowing orbs drifting in darkness. But it was also tense. If your lamp extinguished too soon, it was a bad omen. If it capsized, worse. People watched the river with clenched jaws, hoping their loved ones weren't cursed to wander. Children cried. Parents whispered reassurances they didn't believe. This too was life. Always one step from dread. And when tragedy did strike, when a child died, or a roof collapsed, or a pregnancy failed, People didn't reach for chance or luck. They searched for ritual error, a prayer skipped, an offering forgotten, a clay god knocked over by accident and not properly apologized to. The idea that randomness could govern fate was more terrifying than any vengeful deity. At least a god could be appeased. Chaos could not. Let's be honest, it's easy to mock this from a modern perch, to point out the superstition, the over-ritualization, the constant fear. But are we really so different? We still live by habits we can't explain, still knock on wood, still fear saying certain things out loud. We say we've moved past gods, yet treat algorithms, horoscopes, and manifesting with the same blind reverence. What the Egyptians did, obsessively, endlessly, was craft a world where everything had a reason, where suffering wasn't random, it was earned. That belief, however flawed, gave them strength. If pain had a source, then maybe it could also have a solution. So every morning, Tia lit her incense. She poured the wine. She whispered names older than pyramids into a home too small for privacy and too loud for peace. And every night she thanked the gods for one more day of survival. Not because it had been easy, but because it had been possible. Chapter 5. Born into dust, raised in fear. If survival was the measure of success in ancient Egypt, then childbirth was its first gamble. Every new cry in a mud brick home was celebrated like a small miracle, not because it promised joy, but because it marked the beginning of a battle. To be born Egyptian was to inherit not wealth or comfort, but fragility. The Nile might feed you, the sun might warm you, but disease, hunger, and accident stalked you from the very first breath. A birth was not a private affair. It was a communal event, messy, frightening, and crowded. Midwives, usually older women of experience rather than formal training, guided the process. They brought herbs, amulets, and incantations rather than sterile instruments. The birthing stool, a simple wooden frame with a hole cut through the seat, was the throne of new life. Women crouched, screamed, prayed, and bled on it for generations. Sometimes the baby came easily, sometimes not. And when it did not, the room filled with whispered spells, shouted pleas to Tarat the hippo goddess, and the silent dread of everyone present. Infant mortality was staggering. Half of all children didn't live past 5 years old. A fever, a stomach bug, an insect bite, things we treat today with paracetamol and a shrug, could end a life in days. This reality shaped everything. How people raised their children, how deeply they allowed themselves to bond, how many births were needed just to keep a family alive. And it shaped religion. Every small survival was credited to divine intervention, every loss to human error or divine punishment. Parents used every tool they had to tilt fate in their favor. Infants were adorned with protective amulets, tiny scarabs tied around necks, carved hippos or crocodiles hung from reed cords, charms pressed into soft hands. Mothers sometimes tattooed protective symbols on their thighs or abdomens, visible during childbirth, believed to ward off evil. It wasn't fashion, it was survival art. Breastfeeding was universal, often until age 3 or 4, partly out of necessity, partly out of belief in its protective qualities. Wet nurses existed, but were rare, reserved for elites who could afford to outsource even motherhood. For everyone else, the child stayed close to the mother's skin, fed as often as possible, shielded from flies with linen drapes, and rocked in reed baskets near the kitchen fire. And yet, love persisted. Ancient Egyptian art doesn't shy away from depicting tenderness, mothers kissing babies, fathers holding toddlers, children playing with pets. These images weren't propaganda. They were lived experience carved into stone, proof that even in a world of frequent death, affection was not withheld. If anything, it burned brighter, knowing how fragile it was. As children grew, they were folded quickly into the machinery of daily life. At 6, a boy might help his father haul water. At 7, a girl might weave linen beside her mother. Play existed. Dolls of clay, balls of leather, board games like Senate, but it blurred constantly with training. You learned responsibility by imitating it. You learned survival by enacting it. Childhood wasn't an age bracket. It was a negotiation between innocence and necessity. But the spectre of loss was never far. Archaeologists uncover graves of children buried with toys, dolls tucked under arms, pets sacrificed to accompany them into the afterlife. These aren't just artifacts. They are screams frozen in clay. They tell us that grief was real, that parents carried the same pain we do, the empty room, the unanswered cry, but bore it with a ritual armour that made sense of what sense could not be made of. When a child died, blame rarely rested on chance. A god had been neglected, a ritual skipped, a shadow crossed a shrine at the wrong hour. Families searched obsessively for fault because randomness was unbearable. Better to believe you erred than to accept that the universe could simply snuff out a life without cause. The priests profited from this fear. More offerings, more spells, more amulets. Every tragedy deepened the economy of the sacred. And what of the children who lived? They carried a heavy burden. To replace siblings who had died, to secure the lineage, to justify the prayers. They were precious not for who they were, but for what they represented, continuity. In a civilization obsessed with eternity, every surviving child was proof that eternity hadn't abandoned them just yet. Here lies a dark irony. Ancient Egyptians imagined death as a second life, richly furnished and eternally secure. But real life was precarious, dangerous, short. The afterlife was the utopia. The present was the trial. This duality shaped everything. You cherished your children, but you also armoured them. You loved them fiercely, but you also prepared them to face the unrelenting possibility that they might not see adulthood. It was affection laced with resignation, tenderness braided with fear. Critics often call this fatalistic, even morbid. But perhaps it was honest. Our modern world, with its antiseptic hospitals and miracle drugs, hides death behind curtains and euphemisms. The Egyptians faced it openly, daily. They built shrines in their homes not because they were obsessed with religion, but because they were obsessed with survival. And when survival failed, they at least had the comfort of believing that their children had stepped into a better world. As dusk settled, children who had survived the day, who hadn't drowned in the canal, or succumbed to fever, or wandered too close to a snake, played in the courtyards. Their laughter echoed against mud brick walls, brief defiance against silence. Parents smiled, but never too widely, for fear of tempting fate. Every sound of joy was a reminder of how quickly it could vanish. So when we look at the painted scenes on tomb walls, children chasing birds, families at banquets, mothers nursing infants, we mustn't mistake them for idealized lies. They were wishes carved into permanence. They were hopes written against the inevitability of loss. They were the desperate attempt of a people who knew that life was fragile, but who refused to stop celebrating it anyway. And perhaps that's the greatest paradox of Egypt. A land of death worshippers, obsessed with eternity, yet filled with people who knew better than most how to treasure the brief, painful, precious spark of being alive. In the narrow lanes of an Egyptian village, childhood was always on a countdown clock. The moment a child survived the dangerous first years of life, dodging fever, plague, and the misfortune of contaminated water, the slow, gentle phase we now associate with growing up collapsed under the weight of necessity. By the time you were 10, you were no longer a child in the modern sense. You were a labourer in training, a spouse in waiting, an apprentice for whatever future the gods and your parents could carve out of the Nile's generosity. Take the sons of Dedi and Tia, for instance. If they had lived past the age of 5, no small feat. Their lives quickly fell into rhythm with their fathers. At dawn, they carried water jugs that seemed far too large for their bony arms. They followed their father into the fields, not to play in the mud, but to learn how to irrigate crops without flooding the neighbour's land. They were corrected not with gentle words, but with stinging palms across the back. Survival demanded efficiency. Mistakes wasted water, and wasted water meant hunger. There was no patience for prolonged adolescence. Girls, too, bore their share. They spun thread until their fingertips bled, learned how to bake bread without burning the clay ovens, and managed younger siblings. By 12, many were betrothed. By 14, they were wives. The modern ear recoils, and rightfully so. But in a world where life expectancy hovered around 40, childhood was compressed, marriage accelerated, and motherhood was a race against the inevitability of death. To delay was to risk leaving behind no heirs, no continuation, no anchor in the afterlife. Education, when it existed, was narrow. Sons of the elite might be sent to scribal schools, where discipline was sharp and unrelenting. The lessons were endless repetition, copying hieroglyphs until the reed pens split, memorizing lists of words, reciting prayers to Thoth, the god of wisdom. The punishment for mistakes was not correction, but beating. Records describe bruised hands, swollen eyes, and boys trembling under the gaze of merciless instructors. The lesson was as much about obedience as literacy. The scribe was not just learning to write, he was learning to bend to the machine of state bureaucracy. His ink was power, but it came at the cost of childhood joy. For most children, learning was more practical. They were apprenticed into the family trade. A carpenter's son learned to cut wood. An embalmer's son learned to pack natron into bodies. A potter's daughter learned to shape clay. These weren't hobbies. They were destinies. The word choice barely applied. If your father made bricks, odds were you would too. If your mother brewed beer, so would you. And if you showed resistance, there was little recourse. Hunger had a way of burning away the idea of alternatives. Yet even in this harsh environment, young people found ways to claim moments of freedom. Teenagers gathered at riverbanks to swim, flirt, and sing songs. Love poems, scratched into shards of pottery, reveal that Egyptian youth were just as reckless, hormonal, and impulsive as teenagers today. They snuck glances at one another during festivals, passed tokens of affection, and even ran away together when families refused their unions. The difference was that rebellion often ended not with grounding, but with the forceful pull of marriage contracts and the disapproving weight of entire communities. Marriage itself was less about romance and more about alliance. Families negotiated terms, exchanged dowries, and set expectations. Young brides entered homes where mothers-in-law ruled, where labour was constant, and where childbirth loomed like a daily threat. Young husbands carried their own burdens, to provide food, to obey fathers, to work without pause. And so, adolescence wasn't a period of self-discovery, but of self-erasure. You became what your family needed you to be, whether you wanted to or not. This early end to childhood left scars, though they are hard to read from the fragments of history. We see glimpses in letters where young workers complain of exhaustion, where scribes write about their aching fingers, where temple apprentices beg the gods for mercy after long hours of labour. There's a cruelty in these documents, a recognition that the system worked not by nurturing the young, but by consuming them. And then, of course, came the military. By the late teenage years, boys were often drafted or volunteered into campaigns. Egypt, though stable in many periods, was never free of border tensions. Nubia in the south, Libyan raids in the west, Hittite threats in the north, there was always someone to fight. A teenager could find himself marching hundreds of miles in blistering heat, carrying a spear taller than himself, swatting flies from his face while watching friends die of thirst before even reaching a battlefield. Soldiers were rewarded with land, gold, or women if victorious. If not, they were buried in foreign dust, their names forgotten, their bones stripped by scavengers. Some reward. Criticism is easy here, and necessary. We admire Egypt's art, its stability, its 3,000-year longevity. But that endurance was purchased with the sweat and blood of children pressed into adulthood too soon. A society that built eternity on limestone blocks also built it on the backs of 12-year-olds grinding grain and 14-year-old girls burying their second child. Progress and cruelty coexisted, as they always do, hidden behind golden masks and temple hymns. And yet, we cannot dismiss the resilience of those who endured it. For every record of a child dead too young, there is a painted scene of laughter. For every contract binding a girl to marriage, there is a poem about longing and stolen kisses. For every teenager sent to war, there is a soldier's song about courage and comradeship. Life in Egypt was brief, yes, but it was lived fiercely. It was claimed in fragments of joy carved between obligations. So the children of Egypt, if we can even call them children, walked a line between hope and hardship. They grew fast, suffered early, and bore burdens we would call unbearable. But in their eyes, it was simply life, not tragic, not heroic, just what it meant to be alive in a world where death was close, gods were demanding, and survival was the only rebellion that truly mattered. Chapter 6. Beer, Music, and the Brief Escape from Toil. For all the weight of survival, for all the rituals, contracts, and endless labor, the Egyptians were not machines. They laughed, they danced, they drank, they sought ways to momentarily slip free of the gods' watchful gaze. Leisure wasn't frivolous, it was survival of a different kind. A world so saturated with death and duty needed places to breathe. And so, in courtyards, taverns, and festival grounds, the ordinary people of Egypt forged a culture of escape, one cup of beer, one song, one game at a time. Let's start with beer, because we must. Egyptian beer was not the crisp, golden liquid you imagine frothing in a glass. It was thick, porridge-like, cloudy, and sometimes chewed rather than sipped. Brewed from barley bread left to ferment in water, flavoured occasionally with dates or herbs, it was the staple of daily life. Children drank it, workers drank it, priests drank it, pharaohs drank it. Beer was food, medicine, ritual offering, and social lubricant rolled into one. It filled stomachs when bread ran out, it disinfected when water poisoned, and it dulled the aches of bodies bent too long under the sun. To refuse beer was not asceticism. It was suspicion. Only the sick or the cursed declined a cup. Taverns then became essential spaces. Run often by women, these establishments were simple: reed mats, clay jars, a smoky fire for cooking. They weren't just places to drink. They were hubs of gossip, matchmaking, and negotiation. Farmers discussed grain prices. Traders haggled over shipments. Lovers met in shadowed corners. And inevitably, fights broke out. Archaeological records mention brawls, thefts, and even murders tied to taverns. They were places of freedom, but also of chaos. Tolerated, even cherished, but never wholly respectable. Respectable men claimed they avoided them, yet somehow their names still appeared in complaints scrawled on ostraca about debts left unpaid after drunken nights. Music was everywhere. Harps with long, elegant necks. Double flutes played in shrill harmony. Drums that pulsed through crowds like second heartbeats. Music filled temples, funerals, taverns, and homes. But it wasn't just entertainment. Egyptians believed music had power to soothe spirits, to heal illness, to drive away demons. A song wasn't neutral. It was an incantation. When musicians gathered in courtyards or at feasts, they weren't just playing for fun. They were mediating between the living and the divine. And yet, musicians lived precarious lives. Celebrated in festivals, dismissed in daily life, often women whose beauty and performance drew admiration but also suspicion. Pleasure, in Egypt, always carried a shadow. Games, too, held spiritual weight. The board game Senate, a grid of 30 squares with tokens moved by dice throws, wasn't just a pastime. It represented the journey of the soul through the afterlife, with squares marking traps, blessings, and final ascension. To play was to rehearse eternity. To win was to reassure yourself that perhaps your car, your soul, might succeed when your body failed. Families played together. Children learned the moves before they could write. And in tombs, the game was buried beside the dead. Even fun was haunted. And then there were the festivals. Great explosions of relief amid monotony. Festivals were not optional holidays. They were obligations, yet they offered a kind of joy absent from daily life. Entire towns paraded statues of gods on boats, or carried them through streets lined with dancers, priests, and drunk citizens. The Opet festival in Thebes stretched for weeks, with feasting, music, and the suspension of normal order. Men drank until they collapsed, women sang bawdy songs, hierarchies loosened. For a brief window, life tilted into sanctioned chaos. The gods demanded order, but once or twice a year they demanded ecstasy too. But festivals also revealed a darker side of Egyptian life. They were expensive. Ordinary households were expected to contribute food, labour, or livestock. Those who could not were shamed. And in the chaos of drunken crowds, theft, assault, and violence surged. Some records describe women assaulted during processions, fights breaking out near temple gates, and soldiers forced to patrol wholly. Celebrations with clubs. Joy was real, but so was danger. The gods, apparently, didn't intervene in tavern brawls. Criticism must be voiced here. We tend to romanticize Egyptian leisure. The graceful harpist, the serene board game, the golden beer jar painted on tomb walls. But behind every elegant scene lay cracked teeth, sour brews, and music played by exhausted women for men who often forgot their names by dawn. Leisure, in Egypt, was not free of the weight of survival. It was another arena where power, gender, and class determined who played, who sang, and who drank until their stomachs revolted. Yet, despite these shadows, leisure mattered profoundly. It gave ordinary Egyptians, overworked, underfed, endlessly anxious about divine punishment, moments of release. A night in a tavern might mean forgetting your debts. A song might make you believe your fever would pass. A festival might convince you, however briefly, that you weren't powerless, that the gods were listening, that eternity could wait one more day. Picture Dedi staggering home from a tavern, barley beer thick on his breath, humming a half-forgotten tune. Picture Tia, laughing with neighbours during a festival, swaying to the rhythm of drums even as her feet blistered. Picture their children, playing Senate by the fire, rolling dice, and pretending they controlled fate. These were not illusions. They were strategies for survival. Because sometimes, to endure a brutal world, you needed to pretend it wasn't brutal at all. So Egypt lived not just on bread and work, but on beer, music, and play. And while their pyramids crumble, while their kings' names fade, the echo of laughter, the scrape of dice on clay, and the hum of ancient songs remind us that even in civilizations obsessed with death, life was claimed in fleeting, stubborn bursts of joy. If beer and music were the acceptable masks of Egyptian leisure, then lurking just behind them were the less respectable faces of indulgence. Taverns that blurred into brothels, songs that hinted at flesh more than faith, festivals that began as devotion and ended as chaos. Egypt, like any society, carried a split personality. On one side, rigid rules, cosmic order, divine balance. On the other, an irrepressible hunger for excess. And though the gods demanded harmony, they were suspiciously silent when their worshippers turned sacred gatherings into scenes of scandal. Let's step into a tavern after dark. The oil lamps smoke. The beer jars stand half empty. The air is thick with sweat, smoke, and unwashed linen. Music trickles in through a lone flute, uneven, played by a woman whose hands tremble from exhaustion, but whose beauty is still demanded as part of the performance. Men lean too close, laughter sharp, words slurred. Some are farmers who worked all day, others scribes who worked all week, a few soldiers looking for forgetfulness in cups of cloudy beer. What begins as relief tilts quickly into recklessness. Taverns in Egypt weren't highly regulated, nor were they entirely respectable. They were tolerated because people needed them, but official records and moralizing texts condemned them. Priests scrawled warnings about the dangers of drink, about women selling favors behind smoky walls, about men who squandered their grain rations in one night. Yet the same priests attended festivals where they drank themselves sick in honor of Hathor, goddess of intoxication. Hypocrisy, it seems, is eternal. And those songs we like to imagine as delicate heart ballads, not all were solemn hymns to gods. Some were bawdy, filled with innuendo, the kind of verses that made women giggle and men pretend to be offended before joining in. Erotic songs circulated among common people, sung at weddings, feasts, and sometimes festivals when inhibitions were loosened. One surviving fragment describes a lover as sweet as figs, intoxicating as beer, fierce as a crocodile. Subtle, no. Honest, yes. Egypt had its own version of pub anthems. Only theirs doubled as magical charms to stir desire and fertility. Festivals, the sanctioned eruptions of joy, often slipped into something closer to debauchery. The festival of drunkenness, dedicated to Hathor, required participants to drink themselves into oblivion, to reenact a myth in which humanity was spared destruction through intoxication. It sounds absurd, yet thousands gathered, swaying under the weight of ritual drinking, vomiting in temple courtyards, collapsing into reed beds while priests assured them that the gods were pleased. Archaeologists have found entire temple courtyards littered with beer jars from such events. Holiness and hangovers went hand in hand. But indulgence wasn't without consequence. Too much beer left you vulnerable, to theft, to violence, to humiliation. Records from Deir el-Medina mention men fined for drunken brawls, women accused of sleeping with strangers after festivals, apprentices missing work for days after feasts. The state tolerated excess, but only within limits. Cross the line and you were punished. Yet those punishments rarely curbed the appetite. Human weakness proved more powerful than divine threats. Let's not romanticize this too much. Egyptian pleasure had its exploitations. Many women in taverns were not there freely. Poverty pushed them into roles as servers, entertainers, or worse. Some songs, celebrated as playful, were weapons of pressure, and while elites painted themselves as above it all, their palaces hosted private banquets where indulgence ran wilder than any village tavern. The difference was simple. When the poor did it, it was vice. When the wealthy did it, it was tradition. Still, leisure mattered, even in its darkest forms. It allowed Egyptians to wrest a shred of autonomy from lives otherwise scripted by gods and overseers. In a system where every act of labor was ritual, where every mistake could invite cosmic wrath, the tavern and festival gave people the chance to forget. For a few hours, you weren't a worker, or a wife, or a scribe bending over ink. You were simply a body, swaying, laughing, reckless. You were alive. Daddy, perhaps, found himself one night stumbling home from such a festival. His stomach churned, his sandals lost, his head pounding from beer and smoke. Tia, waiting with arms crossed, muttered a curse under her breath. Not a magical one, but the universal kind of curse every exhausted wife mutters when her husband reeks of barley and bad decisions. Their children, peeking from mats, giggled. Tomorrow he would return to the fields, ashamed but also strangely lighter, because even shame was proof of choice, and choice was rare. Criticism is necessary here. We admire Egypt's spiritual sophistication, its supposed order, its carved promises of eternity. But behind the hymns and hieroglyphs lay a truth. They were people. Flawed, greedy, lustful, desperate to escape themselves, just like us. The difference is that their gods weren't silent on these matters. They encouraged it, demanded it even, under the guise of ritual. Modern religions draw lines between sacred and profane. Egypt blurred them until the lines vanished. And perhaps that is why their civilization lasted so long. Because it allowed for contradiction. It demanded devotion but permitted indulgence. It enforced order but sanctioned chaos in measured doses. It let its people stagger, laugh, vomit, and sin under the protection of Hathor's smile. And in doing so, it gave them resilience. So while the pyramids stand as monuments to eternity, the true essence of Egypt lived not in stone, but in sound. The clatter of dice, the thrum of drums, the laughter in taverns, the whispered songs of women too bold for temple walls. A people who embraced joy, not in spite of death, but because of it. Chapter 7. Illness, Incantations, and the Fragile Body. No matter how much beer you drank, how many songs you sang, or how many charms you tied around your children's necks, the body in ancient Egypt was fragile. Disease didn't care about your prayers. Parasites swam in the Nile. Insects nested in reed mats. A simple cut could turn black with infection. And yet, this was a civilization that didn't just suffer. It fought back with an extraordinary mixture of medicine, magic, and sheer stubbornness. To fall ill in Egypt was to step into a labyrinth of herbs, chants, and desperate hope. Egyptian medicine was sophisticated by the standards of the ancient world. They knew the value of honey as an antibacterial, used mouldy bread as a kind of primitive antibiotic, and brewed herbal concoctions from garlic, onions, lotus, and juniper. They set broken bones with splints, stitched wounds with linen thread, and even practiced a form of dentistry, though dentistry often meant yanking the offending tooth and praying the swelling didn't spread. But for all their cleverness, medicine was never separated from religion. Every remedy came wrapped in ritual. Doctors were priests, or priests were doctors. The distinction barely mattered. If you went to a healer with stomach cramps, he might prescribe ground carob mixed with beer. But he would also chant an incantation to banish the spirit believed to be gnawing at your intestines. A headache could be treated with willow bark paste, effective since it contains salicylic acid, the ancestor of aspirin. But you would also wear an amulet of Hathor, because pain was never just physical. It was moral, spiritual, cosmic. To ignore one side was to invite failure. And sometimes failure came anyway. Consider the parasites. The Nile, for all its bounty, carried schistosomes, tiny worms that burrowed into the bladder and intestines, causing bloody urine, swelling, fatigue. Entire villages suffered. Archaeological studies of mummies show calcified eggs of these parasites still lodged in organs thousands of years later. Imagine the daily discomfort, the constant pain, the resigned acceptance that blood and urine was simply part of life. And yet, priests explained it not as biology, but as punishment, a god's anger, a curse from an ancestor, the shadow of a forgotten sin. Tuberculosis scarred lungs. Leprosy disfigured flesh. Malaria haunted marshy regions. There were no cures, only coping mechanisms. And the darkest reality? Many children never stood a chance. Infant graves line the edges of settlements, tiny bodies wrapped in linen, laid with dolls or amulets. For parents like Dedi and Tia, every cough in the night was terror. Every fever was a coin toss between survival and a funeral. Love was deep because loss was near. Criticism here is unavoidable. We admire Egyptian medicine for its creativity, honey, mould, herbal remedies. But we must also see the cruelty of ignorance. A child might die not because there was no remedy, but because a healer chose a spell over sanitation. A woman in childbirth might bleed to death while the midwife chanted at a clay figurine. Illness was treated, but always through a lens of blame. The patient hadn't honoured the gods enough. The family had skipped an offering. Someone's shadow had fallen on the shrine at the wrong moment. Guilt was medicine as much as garlic. And then there was the strange theatre of surgery. Surgical instruments made of bronze, knives, hooks, cautery tools, have been found in tombs. Some procedures worked. Others were brutal experiments. Without anesthesia, pain was endured in silence or drowned in beer. Patients sometimes survived. More often, they did not. But success was remembered as divine favour, and failure dismissed as the will of the gods. The healer, conveniently, was absolved. One of the most unsettling discoveries comes from papyri filled with diagnoses. They are methodical, almost clinical. If you examine a man with swelling in his belly and he is feverish, you say he has disease X. If you treat him with Y and he recovers, good. If he does not, this is a disease not to be treated. It's cold. Detached. Pragmatic to the point of cruelty. Some illnesses, they believed, were simply untreatable. Signs of divine judgment rather than human ailment. And those afflicted were left to die, wrapped in linen, prayed over, and written off as inevitable losses. Yet even within this grim reality, there were glimpses of hope. Midwives applied honey to umbilical cords to prevent infection, and it worked. Eye infections were soothed with copper salts, painful, but sometimes effective. Women chewed acacia pods, whose gum contained spermicidal properties, as primitive contraception. Egyptians experimented, observed, and passed down what seemed to work. And while superstition clouded much, their trial and error laid foundations still recognizable in modern medicine. Imagine Tia caring for her sick child. She crushes garlic into a paste, mixes it with honey, and forces it down the boy's throat while muttering a spell to banish the demon causing his cough. She ties an amulet of bez around his neck, hoping the dwarf god will protect him in the night. Daddy stands nearby, helpless, watching, knowing that if the fever worsens, the priests will say they failed in devotion. The weight is unbearable, and still they hope, because hope was the one medicine everyone could afford. The priests themselves were not immune to irony. They treated pharaohs with the same herbs, the same chants, the same imperfect rituals. Kings died of infections, tooth abscesses, and malaria, just like peasants. Eternity could be purchased in gold coffins, but not in health. Death levelled all. That truth, perhaps, explains Egypt's obsession with the afterlife. When the present was so uncertain, eternity was the only stability they could imagine. And so the body remained fragile, but the spirit was armoured with belief. Every potion had a prayer, every scar had a story, every grave had an explanation. And while science slowly flickered in their hands, religion remained the torch they clung to in the dark. We can criticize, rightly, the failures of superstition, but we should also acknowledge the resilience of the people who refused to accept suffering as meaningless. They may have been wrong about causes, but they were not wrong about dignity. They fought to give every pain a reason, every death a context, every survival a blessing. And in that, they remind us that medicine is not just about curing, it's about comforting. And comfort, sometimes, is enough. Disease in ancient Egypt was more than a private horror. At times, it moved like a sandstorm, sweeping through entire villages, upsetting harvests, decimating families, and shifting the balance of power in a kingdom that believed itself blessed by gods. Epidemics in the Nile Valley didn't just sicken the body, they exposed the cracks in Egyptian certainty, where divine favour was supposed to guard the land and pharaohs claimed to rule by cosmic alignment. But germs had no respect for ideology. There's no word in ancient Egyptian that perfectly matches our modern concept of plague, but their texts speak of great pestilence, of fever that consumes, and of days when blood poured from the mouth and nose, grisly descriptions we now recognise as signs of hemorrhagic fevers or severe dysentery. When outbreaks struck, they weren't understood as microbial invasions. Instead, they were blamed on curses, angry deities, or disruptions to mar the divine balance. It wasn't just bad luck, it was cosmic punishment. Take the Ipuwer Papyrus, a chaotic, poetic lament from the Second Intermediate Period. It speaks of times when the rich became poor, the rivers ran red, and death visited without warning. Scholars debate whether it describes an actual plague or a metaphor for political collapse. But the imagery is clear: widespread death, social panic, and divine silence. In times of mass sickness, Egypt's stable facade cracked, and people grasped for meaning in a world that suddenly seemed unjust. Imagine Dedi and Tia living in a workers' village during such an outbreak. It begins with coughing. A child falls ill. Then another. Soon entire households are silent. The overseer no longer knocks for work. The temple's incense smells more like desperation than devotion. Priests chant night and day, their voices hoarse, their hands trembling. Dedi watches his neighbours dig shallow graves in sand that refuses to stay still. Tia boils garlic for the 10th time that week, not because it works, but because it's something to do. The state responded in ways both logical and terrifying. There are records of settlements being abandoned, of dwellings burned to stop the spread, of amulets mass-produced in panic. Priests doubled their rituals, temples closed their doors to the sick, and rumours spread faster than fever. Blame was laid quickly. Foreigners, impure offerings, neglected tombs, someone must always be responsible. There was no concept of patient zero, but there was always a scapegoat. And still, amidst the dread, there was a strange calm. Egypt had always been obsessed with death. Now, in plague, that obsession turned practical. Coffin makers became the busiest tradesmen. Scribes documented deaths with eerie detachment. Died of heat. Taken by the red cough. The gods called him. Euphemism was a balm. It disguised the horror with poetic inevitability. One of the darkest facts? The elite were not spared. Mummies of nobles show signs of chronic illness, bone infections, tuberculosis, and parasites. Tomb paintings show scenes of health and beauty, but beneath the paint, skeletons tell a different story. Even priests wrapped in gold thread died coughing blood, and pharaohs, children of gods, rotted just as quickly when the fevers came. But what's perhaps most remarkable is how Egyptians processed collective suffering. They ritualized it. After plagues, temples would host mass ceremonies to cleanse the land. Farmers would offer the first cut of harvest in apology. Entire festivals were held not in joy, but in sorrow, a communal exhale of grief. In one such rite, people cried publicly, wailing and tearing their garments to mimic the mourning of Osiris's death. This wasn't drama. It was therapy. Criticism must return here. For all its splendour, Egypt failed to truly learn from these waves of death. No new sanitation systems emerged. No concept of contagion ever took root. The poor continued to drink Nile water tainted with excrement. Tombs were prioritised over toilets. Their faith may have soothed fear, but it stifled innovation. And perhaps that's the real tragedy: the divine was louder than the diseased. Still, you cannot blame the people entirely. With no microscopes, no antibiotics, no germ theory, what else could they do but seek patterns in the stars and hope the gods were listening? In the chaos of plague, ritual was structure. It gave grieving families a script. It gave children an explanation. It gave a dying woman the belief that her suffering was not in vain, but part of a sacred story she would soon join. And so, Egypt survived its plagues, not through immunity, but through mythology. Death was not the end. Illness was not meaningless. Even the coughing child had a place in the cosmic cycle. Dedi might bury his friend one day, build a tomb for his neighbour the next, but at sunset he would still light a lamp for the gods, still whisper a prayer, still believe. Because to stop believing was worse than the sickness itself. Chapter 8. Cloth, Colour and Class. Dressing the living and the dead. To the casual observer, the ancient Egyptians all looked alike. White linen, shaved heads, gold jewellery if they were lucky. But dig deeper. Past the sand-polished stereotypes, and you discover a complex language of fabric, colour and thread that told stories more revealing than any scroll. In Egypt, clothing was status. It was religion. It was armor. And in some cases, it was the last word you spoke to the world before entering your tomb. Let's start with the basics. Linen was king. Made from flax, a tough, fibrous plant that needed soaking, beating, and an almost masochistic level of labor, linen was the only acceptable fabric for those who could afford it. Wool existed, but it came with religious baggage. It was seen as impure, often forbidden in temples, and never used in burial. Linen, on the other hand, was clean, white, and cooling, a God-approved cloth. But not all linen was created equal. The elite wore versions so finely woven they seemed transparent, shimmering like dragonfly wings in the sunlight. The poor, like Didi and Tia, wore coarse, stiff tunics that chafed at the shoulders and wore thin at the thighs. There was no shame in it, just reality. When your job involved hauling bricks or grinding grain, you didn't need fashion, you needed function. Still, even the poorest Egyptian tried to look respectable. Clean linen, however rough, was a sign of dignity. Colour was another marker. Despite the Hollywood whitewashings, Egyptian clothing was not colourless. Natural dyes from indigo, saffron, ochre and madder added blues, reds and golds to collars, belts and sashes. But these were expensive, reserved for the upper class. Wearing a deep blue linen robe wasn't just a style choice, it was a declaration: I have wealth, I have influence, I have access to a dye that cost more than your house. And then there was jewellery. Oh, the jewellery. Scarabs, broad collars, anklets, finger rings, diadems, gold, silver, faience, lapis lazuli. Even the poorest might own a simple amulet, perhaps of the protective god bees, strung on a cord of palm fibre. For women, makeup was just as important, not vanity, but virtue. Kohl lined the eyes not just for beauty, but to reduce glare and repel flies. Red ochre brightened cheeks. Scented oils masked the smells of labour. These were not luxuries. They were tools for survival, socially and spiritually. But here's where the darker truth begins to fray the hem. Clothing was a cage. You were what you wore, and deviating from your class uniform invited scrutiny. If a servant wore a noble's sash, it wasn't ambition. It was blasphemy. Women were judged harshly on how much skin they showed. A sheer dress on a priestess was sacred. The same dress on a common girl was scandal. Double standards stitched into every seam. Critically, the pressure to appear clean and proper existed in a land where water wasn't always available. Laundering was a luxury. Soap, as we know it, didn't exist. Instead, a paste of natron, a harsh salt, and water was rubbed into clothes and skin. Imagine scrubbing your only tunic with gritty brine, hoping it dried before morning. Now imagine doing that every other day while working in a mud brick bakery. Still wonder why people stank. And yet, in death, all sins of smell and sweat were erased. Mummies were swaddled in linen of varying quality. The rich were embalmed with layer upon layer, each with inscriptions and perfumes. The poor? A simple wrapping, maybe a reed mat. But still linen. Always linen. Death democratized fashion, if only a little, because even in the afterlife, style mattered. The gods were watching. Tombs tell us much about these textile obsessions. Painted scenes show women adjusting pleats, servants delivering mirrors and perfumes, men lounging in embroidered kilts. Statues wear the finest imagined garments. And then there are the real finds. Tunics folded carefully in burial chests, sandals made of papyrus, wigs still holding their curls. Clothing wasn't just for life, it was for eternity. Imagine Tia preparing for a festival. She has one good dress, cleaned with effort, patched at the shoulder, tightened with a rope belt. She adds her one piece of jewellery, a faded bead necklace. Daddy combs his hair, smooths his tunic, and applies a hint of oil from a bottle gifted long ago. They walk into the crowd, not wealthy, not radiant, but proud. They know they look their best. And in that moment, that's enough. The irony? Many of the gods they worshipped wore exaggerated versions of human dress. Isis in a pleated gown that no mortal could afford. Horus in a collar that would have fed a village. The divine set the standard, and mortals strained to imitate it. Which leads us to ask, was fashion ever really about expression in ancient Egypt? Or was it just one more way to chase divinity? To look a little less human, a little more sacred? So yes, the Egyptians were stylish. But that style came at a cost of labour, of conformity, of class tension disguised as aesthetics. Their wardrobes were beautiful, but they were also burdens. And like so much else in Egypt, they hid discomfort behind ritual, elegance behind effort, and truth behind thread. The climate of Egypt was kind to linen, to papyrus, to bodies that didn't move once buried. But it wasn't kind to vanity. Under a blazing sun, sweating in mud brick homes or hauling stone blocks, the human body did what it always does. It aged, it smelled, yet somehow the Egyptians maintained an illusion of eternal freshness. Through wigs, perfumes, pastes, and unspoken rules, they crafted an aesthetic of immortality while very much alive. But peel it back, and you find a culture obsessed with decay, trying desperately to keep it at bay. Let's begin at the top, literally. Hair. Shaving the head was common, not only for comfort but hygiene. Lice were rampant, heat unbearable, and water a luxury. A shaved head was clean, simple, and socially accepted. But baldness was not stylish. So in came the wigs, crafted from human hair, wool, or even palm fibres, often stiffened with beeswax to maintain curls. Some were short and practical, others extravagantly braided with gold wire, beads, or blue faience tiles. A well-made wig was a symbol of status. A poorly made one, a public embarrassment. Wigs weren't just fashion, they were theatre. A woman might wear one to temple, not just to honour the gods, but to become a different version of herself, a purified form. Imagine Tia, wrapping her shaved head in a linen cap before pinning on a borrowed wig. For a few hours, she's not a baker's wife. She's a noble woman. She smells like lilies. She walks more slowly. She smiles less. The performance matters. Didi, too, might wear a small wig or even paint his scalp for festival days. Appearance wasn't vanity, it was survival. Now, the scent. Ancient Egypt stank. The Nile brought life, but also mosquitoes, rot, and the scent of open defecation. People lived close. Animals shared homes. Corpses weren't always far away, so they fought back with perfume. Kaifi, a sacred blend of frankincense, myrrh, cinnamon, raisins and wine, was burned in temples, but also dabbed behind ears. Oils infused with lotus, mint and cardamom masked both body odour and class. Perfume was a tax item, a temple offering, and a luxury good. The wealthy had it in abundance. The poor made do with cheaper versions, sometimes rancid, but anything was better than sweat. One grim detail: perfume cones. Often shown in tomb art as white blobs atop heads, these were likely real conical lumps of scented wax or fat placed on wigs or hair, meant to melt slowly and release fragrance. In theory, lovely. In practice, you're walking around with melting grease trickling down your scalp in 40-degree heat. But to smell good was divine. And sometimes, the divine was disgusting. Cosmetics too played their role. Kohl for the eyes wasn't just for beauty. It reduced glare, prevented infections, and created an illusion of wide, divine-like eyes. Red ochre for cheeks and lips gave signs of life in a culture that feared the stillness of death. Henna-stained nails and palms, a reminder that beauty was not only for others to see, but for the gods to recognize. Every cosmetic had a practical purpose wrapped in mysticism. Even the dead were painted, as if the journey to the afterlife demanded a full face. But here's where the contradiction stings. While the Egyptians believed in preservation, they also edited reality. A decaying body was unacceptable, so it was transformed. In life, a wrinkled face was not wise but problematic. Paintings and statues smoothed the skin, idealized the figure. A woman of 50 might be depicted as eternally 20. A scribe with arthritis is painted with straight back and fine hands. The obsession with youth wasn't modern. It was already ancient. Criticism? Absolutely. For all their philosophical musings on death, the Egyptians feared decay so much they covered it with cosmetics and ritual, like a child hiding under a blanket. They embalmed bodies but ignored dental rot. They painted ideal physiques while slaves wasted away in quarries. Their art whispered eternity, but their reality was sweat, wrinkles, boils, and bad breath. And like so many cultures, they sold beauty to the elite while the poor had to improvise. Still, it worked. In the end, Egypt left behind a visual legacy of serene faces, scented gods, and impossible perfection. Visitors today still marvel at Nefertiti's bust, her painted eyes gazing across time, flawless and ageless. But beneath that paint was a woman who bled, who aged, who maybe hated how her perfume cone dripped down her neck. And Daddy, on special days, he wore his cleanest tunic, rubbed a drop of oil on his wrists, and watched Tia pin her wig with care. He smiled, not because they looked wealthy, but because for a moment they didn't look like themselves. They looked like someone the gods might notice, someone they might save. Because in Egypt, if you smelled good, looked radiant, and played the part, perhaps you could delay decay just a little longer. Chapter 9. Temples, Taxes, and the Machinery of Faith. From afar, the temples of ancient Egypt appeared eternal. Stone behemoths standing stubborn against the passage of time, their walls etched with gods and victories, their halls echoing chants meant to bridge heaven and earth. But behind the incense and intonation there was machinery, grinding quietly, persistently. Temples were not just places of worship. They were banks, tax offices, storage centres, schools, political headquarters, and in many ways the true engines of Egyptian society. To understand ancient Egypt, you had to understand its temples and the soft hum of power they generated. The gods were everywhere, but the temples made them tangible. You didn't just believe in Amun or Horus or Isis. You visited them. You brought offerings, paid fines, received blessings, and in return, the temple kept a ledger. Yes, a literal ledger. Priests recorded donations of grain, land, cattle, perfumes, even time. Everything was transactional. You brought wheat for a good harvest. You offered a jug of beer in exchange for your son's healing. You sacrificed a goose, hoping to avoid a plague. But behind the ceremony, there were scribes, accountants, inventory keepers. Holiness had a paper trail. The largest temples, like Karnak, were cities unto themselves. They employed thousands, not just priests, but cooks, guards, builders, dancers, weavers, and even brewers. Temples owned land, and lots of it. Entire villages existed simply to supply temple needs. Farmers paid part of their crop to temples as tax, sometimes more than to the pharaoh. In return, a blessing. Maybe. If the gods were listening. If the priests deemed you worthy. Critically, priesthood wasn't a calling. It was a career. And a privileged one. High priests of Amun wielded more influence than many royal advisors. They decided festival dates, interpreted omens, and even shaped law. They wore leopard skins, held scepters, and whispered secrets no commoner would hear. But don't mistake them for saints. Many were corrupt. They siphoned off donations, rewrote rituals to suit political allies, and formed dynasties within dynasties. The gods didn't always approve, but the gods, conveniently, stayed silent. And yet, for the average Egyptian like Dedi and Tia, temples were necessary. Life was hard. Disease, famine, war, and river floods loomed over everything. The temple offered structure. Festivals provided joy. Rituals gave meaning. Even the bureaucratic coldness had a comfort to it. If you brought your offering, recited the proper prayer, stood in the right line, maybe, just maybe, your dead child would find peace in the field of reeds. It's easy to mock this now, to see the hypocrisy. But consider the alternative, chaos. The Nile might flood unpredictably, crops might fail, the pharaoh might raise taxes again. But the temple had an answer. It always had an answer. And if it didn't, it invented one. Divine anger, bad stars, forgotten rituals, all wrapped in incense and mystery. One particularly haunting truth: the temples didn't only collect taxes from the living. They claimed rights to the dead. If your burial wasn't sanctioned by the right rituals, your soul could wander unrested. That came with a price. Sometimes gold, sometimes grain, sometimes your daughter sent into temple service. Religion wasn't free. Holiness was monetized. Even architecture was weaponized. Temples were built with towering pylons, long access halls, and sanctuaries hidden in deep recesses. The message was clear. The gods are distant. You must earn your way toward them. Daddy might stand in the outer court, sweat slick on his back, straining to see the gilded statue of Osiris glimpse through 5 doorways. He'd never be allowed inside. Not really. That privilege belonged to those who spoke for the gods and charged a fee for the translation. The irony? The same gods who demanded order and tribute were often portrayed as nurturing, forgiving. Isis, cradling the sick. Hathor, goddess of joy and music. But their temples? Cold, calculating, and often brutal in their bureaucracy. The divine and the draconian side by side. And Tia, lighting a small oil lamp for Bastet, whispering a prayer for her unborn child. She leaves a string of dried figs, the only offering she can spare. Behind her, a priest silently collects it, notes the donation, and moves on. No blessing, no miracle, just a system that keeps running, fueled by faith and fig taxes. Yet, for all this criticism, one can't deny the brilliance of it. The temples kept knowledge. They maintained calendars, stored food during famine, and recorded medical treatments. They weren't just spiritual centers. They were the nervous system of Egypt. Without them, the body of the nation might have collapsed. But the next time someone says ancient Egyptians were purely spiritual, remind them of this: spirituality in Egypt was legied, taxed, centered, and sometimes bribed. Sacrifice. The word conjures fire, blood, solemn hymns, and trembling supplicants. But in ancient Egypt, sacrifice was far more varied and far more calculated. It could mean a bull slain under a painted portico, but it could also be a loaf of bread left on an altar, or the hours a widow spent weaving temple cloth she could never afford herself. It could even be silence, not protesting when your crops were taken for temple tribute, or when your son was chosen as a labor offering. Sacrifice in Egypt had many forms, but they all shared one thing: they were expected. Let's talk about what was given first. Animals, of course. Cattle, geese, fish, even ibises and cats were offered to appease the gods. But few Egyptians could afford this kind of sacrifice. It was the domain of temples, royalty, or the elite. When an ox was slaughtered for Amun, the blood flowed for politics as much as for piety. These public displays reminded the masses who had access to divine favor and who didn't. The meat often never reached the people. It went to the priests, the scribes, the temple kitchens. The gods may have required blood, but it was the bureaucracy that feasted. More common was the offering table, a slab of stone before a god's statue where the faithful placed whatever they could: onions, beer, pomegranates, bread. Offerings were symbolic, sure, but the temple still used them. Inscriptions carved beside the offering table rarely said thank you. Instead, they outlined proper protocol: expected quantity, and penalties for skimping. Tia, praying for her sick child, might bring a few dried dates, whisper a desperate prayer, and leave them on the altar. Hours later, a priest or assistant would collect them, tally the donation, and file the request, assuming it passed inspection. And that's where things get political. The gods were impartial. But the priests, they weren't. Some petitions were denied, some offerings returned, some prayers misplaced. Favoritism was real. Influence could be bought. Wealthier donors received more favorable interpretations of omens. Inscriptions lasted longer. Blessings echoed louder. The divine court, it turns out, operated like any other court, with whispers, deals, and favors. Now, human offerings. Contrary to popular belief, ancient Egypt didn't regularly practice human sacrifice, but they came close. Servants were sometimes buried with nobles in early dynasties, a grim loyalty. Children were conscripted into temple service. Labourers volunteered to work on temple estates without pay. These were called sacrifices of time, effort and blood, just phrased more politely. Dedi might spend 3 weeks hauling temple bricks, not because he chose to, but because his village owed a divine tax. No gold exchanged hands, just sweat and silence. Then came the offerings never spoken aloud, the emotional sacrifices. A woman might be forced to send her son to the temple to gain favour from a deity, knowing she may never see him again. A farmer might watch his entire harvest taken during a drought and thank the gods instead of cursing them. Public displays of piety were mandatory. Doubt was dangerous. Heresy didn't require blasphemy, just an eyebrow raised in the wrong moment. This silence was enforced by fear and faith. The myth of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and balance, loomed large. She wasn't just cosmic order, she was social control. Deviate from prescribed rituals, question a priest's judgment, complain about temple levies, and you risked being labelled chaotic, dangerous, even cursed. Your soul might be weighed against a feather in the afterlife. But in reality, it was already being weighed here in hushed tones and withheld blessings. Critically, the state and the temple reinforced each other. The pharaoh, supposedly a god in human form, depended on temples to legitimize his rule. Temples, in turn, relied on pharaohs for protection and privilege. When one grew too powerful, it was a problem. At times, temples owned more land than the royal court. They commanded armies. They influenced succession. A pharaoh might kneel before Amun in one breath and plot to defund his priests in the next. Through all this, the commoners adapted. They learned which festivals offered free bread, which priests were more lenient, which gods ignored the poor. Dedi and Tia didn't believe every promise, but they couldn't afford not to participate. Not when blessings meant water for crops or healing for fevers. So they lit the incense, they bowed, they offered their silence. And the gods? They remained unmoved, or at least silent, because sacrifice in Egypt wasn't about divine conversation. It was about maintaining a very human order, one offering at a time. Chapter 10: Death, Embalming, and the Business of Immortality. There is a particular smell that clings to the air around embalming workshops, a mixture of resin, natron, decay, and time. In ancient Egypt, this was the scent of hope, or fear, or profit. Death was not merely the end of life. It was the start of a business transaction, a ritual performance, and an intricate journey through the most bureaucratically spiritual system the ancient world had to offer. The dead did not simply die. They applied for eternity. Let's start with the basics. The dead were not buried as they fell. First came the embalmers, men who operated on the periphery of society, respected but also feared, like morticians or butchers of sacred flesh. These men knew secrets no one else dared whisper. How to cut open a corpse, remove a brain with a hooked wire through the nose, how to drain a body of fluids, and how to preserve a face just enough to fool a grieving family. The body was washed, anointed, and carefully sliced. Organs were removed and preserved in canopic jars, each guarded by one of the 4 sons of Horus. The stomach, intestines, lungs, and liver all had their own deity protector. The heart, ideally, remained in the body, for it would be weighed in the afterlife against the feather of Ma'at. If your heart was heavier, full of sin or shame or perhaps just bad luck, it would be devoured by a crocodile-headed demon named Ammit. Eternal damnation. Gone in one bite. But even this metaphysical test had a price tag. Only those who could afford the proper rites were given a chance at eternity. The poor were buried quickly, sometimes communally, in sand graves that offered natural desiccation but no ritual. Their names vanished with the wind. Meanwhile, the wealthy could purchase a 70-day embalming package, complete with ceremonial chants, golden masks, painted coffins, and a linen wrapping so extensive it could cocoon the truth right out of the corpse. It was a spectacle. Priests dressed as Anubis, the jackal-headed god of the dead, would perform rituals beside the body. Prayers were read from the Book of the Dead, a collection of spells and instructions for navigating the underworld. Don't go left at the 3rd gate. Don't eat the bread offered by the wrong spirit. Don't forget your own name. It was an instruction manual for eternity, as if the afterlife were just another government office with poor signage. But there was always room for error. Miss a step, skip a payment, forget a charm, and the soul could be lost. Trapped. Doomed to wander. Or worse, judged unfairly because a priest was inattentive or greedy. There were whispers that some embalmers cut corners, that bodies were swapped, that cheaper resins were used, that prayers were mumbled with half a heart. But who would complain? The dead? Critically, the business of embalming was stratified. The upper-class dead received boutique care. Their tombs were stocked with food, wine, combs, makeup, amulets, and statues meant to serve them in the afterlife. Servant figurines, called ushabtis, were buried in the dozens or hundreds to perform labour on their behalf. Even in death, the rich outsourced. And then there was the sarcophagus stone coffins carved with protective spells and images of the deceased in idealized form, not as they died, but as they wished to be remembered. Young, strong, serene, sometimes with symbols of status, priestly robes, scepters, crowns. Death wasn't just a passage, it was branding. Tia, watching her uncle's funeral, might weep at the chants, never knowing that her family had gone into debt to afford the linen, or that the tomb builder had reused a stone slab from another client. Daddy, walking past a line of anonymous graves, might wonder if his name would be remembered, if he would be wrapped with care or simply buried in sand and forgotten, because memory mattered. To be remembered was to live again. Tomb inscriptions pleaded, "Say my name, that I may live." To speak the name of the dead was an act of resurrection, but names faded, and so did eternity for those who couldn't pay to preserve them. This was the true cruelty of the Egyptian afterlife. It was beautiful, detailed, and exclusive. A reward for the obedient, the wealthy, or the fortunate. For everyone else, it was silence. A silence that could last forever. And the embalmers? They lit their incense, sharpened their blades, and began again. Another body. Another journey. Another ledger filled. The tomb was never as silent as it appeared. Beneath its heavy limestone lid and painted ceilings, time pressed in from all directions. The air inside, once perfumed with incense, grew stale. The food offerings moulded. The amulets cracked. The eternal sleep of the ancient Egyptian elite was not eternal at all. Because outside those carefully sealed doors, someone was always watching. Someone with a chisel, a torch, and a very human hunger. Grave robbing in ancient Egypt wasn't a fringe activity. It was an industry. Not just the desperate poor sneaking in at night, but sometimes even the same workers who had built the tombs. They knew the layouts, the hiding places, the weight of a gold amulet. And the truth? Many of them were unpaid or underpaid. When the temples delayed wages or withheld food, breaking the law became a form of survival or revenge. Imagine Dadi again, only now not as a farmer, but as a tomb builder. He spends months carving out chambers, painting hieroglyphs, lifting slabs that could crush a dozen men. He is promised bread and beer. Sometimes he gets them, sometimes he doesn't. One day, his friend vanishes, punished, they say, for stealing a copper tool. Dadi starts to notice other things vanish too. His faith, his patience, his belief that death is just. So when he hears of a priest's tomb, lightly guarded and rumoured to hold lapis lazuli and unguents, he doesn't ask the gods for guidance. He waits for a moonless night. And still, the robbers feared the curses. Oh yes, the curses were real. Not in a magical sense, perhaps, but in their power to haunt. Tombs carried warnings. May the crocodile consume you, or may your name be erased. To have your name erased was a second death. Robbers might steal the gold, but they rarely destroyed the name. Too risky. Even the greedy had limits. Yet not all curses were metaphors. Ancient records show that some tombs were booby-trapped doors that collapsed, ceilings that cracked under torch heat, narrow passages meant to trap the unwary. And when tombs weren't protected by stone, they were protected by people. In some periods, state-sponsored guards patrolled necropolises, but guards could be bribed. Hierarchies broke down. Even kings' tombs weren't safe. The Valley of the Kings is a graveyard of broken promises, a place where eternal rest was interrupted by very mortal needs. Pharaohs tried to adapt. Later dynasties buried royalty in hidden, undecorated tombs far from the fanfare. They hoped secrecy would succeed where spells had failed. But word always leaked. Maps were drawn, secrets traded. A single grave might be robbed and re-robbed across decades, each intruder finding less, but caring little. Bronze tools, linen wrappings, even mummified pets. Nothing was sacred when survival was at stake. And here's the irony. The priests, the embalmers, the architects, they sold immortality as a guarantee. Do this, buy that, chant these words, and eternity is yours. But the truth was simpler and crueler. Only memory preserved the dead. Only the story told generations later could keep a soul alive. And even that faded. Tombs were desecrated, names were lost, legacies decayed. The most enduring figures of ancient Egypt. Tutankhamun, Ramses, Cleopatra. They weren't remembered because of their embalming or offerings. They were remembered because someone found them, wrote about them, profited off their remains. Their immortality is our curiosity, and even that has a cost. When Howard Carter opened King Tut's tomb in 1922, the world gasped. Gold, chariots, amulets, curses. But Carter also chiseled through sacred seals, removed objects, disrupted a system meant to remain untouched. Museums filled, catalogues swelled, and the mummy of a boy king became a global exhibit, torn from his afterlife and pressed into ours. It's hard not to view this with a thread of criticism. Egypt built a civilization obsessed with the afterlife, but it underestimated the living, the poor, the forgotten, the opportunistic, the scholar with a notebook, the tourist with a camera, and in doing so, it revealed the flaw in its grand promise. Eternity was never safe from humanity. Today, thousands of tombs remain buried, unknown, their curses dormant. But they are not silent. Each cracked stone, each faded glyph tells us something. About vanity, about fear, about a people who built monuments so they wouldn't be forgotten, only to be remembered for how often they were disturbed. So as you close your eyes tonight, imagine the desert wind brushing over half-buried lintels. Somewhere, deep beneath the sand, a name waits to be spoken again. or to be stolen. If history lulled you into sleep tonight, leave a like and share the dream. Subscribe to the Drowsy Historian for more slow, strange, and softly disturbing tales from the past. Until next time, may your sleep be deep and your ancestors quiet.